Welcome to November. We have a completely unsurprising theme for this month, which is democracy. So this month we'll be answering some, I think, really important questions. What is the relationship in America between the church and the state? Who is in our democracy, and how do we come to be good to one another and to form really a national community as well as local communities? What are the characteristics that makes good citizens, and how can we foster those within us? And I am going to be really answering that last question around the characteristics of a good citizen in a couple weeks, but I want to preview kind of one important quality, and that's discernment, a discerning mind, a discerning people. And so today, as I talk about the role between the church and the state and the relationship between the church and the state, I'm going to be offering you some questions for discernment. So church and state, sometimes I've always heard about growing up around how sacred the value of the separation of church and state is in America. And most of my life I've heard about it kind of along these lines, that America has a separation of church and state, which means that the government does not provide resources or encouragement for its people to practice any particular faith, and does not require them to have any faith at all, or any religious practice at all. And that much of this has evolved to find out ways to make sure that those flow of resources, or that there's a subtle kind of tipping of the scales towards one faith versus another, making sure that those things aren't happening through school prayer, for instance. But there is another aspect of this question that reveals kind of the importance of the separation of church and state that I have only learned by studying history. And so my main point today, isn't it always good when you know you get the main point early so that way you could relax and not have to listen so hard for the rest of the sermon? My main point today is that in times in history when the state gets it wrong, the state being society with its leaders and the laws gets it wrong, then the free church ought to provide a key moral voice of dissent. That the church at those times ought to supply a key moral voice of dissent. And it can only do that if it's a separate and free body. Amen. No, yeah. So I can point to American history, to the abolitionist movement, or the labor movement, or the prohibition movement, or the civil rights movement, or America, and how some of its churches and Unitarian, Universalist churches functioned under the McCarthy years, and how McCarthy worked to suppress voices of dissent that were concerned about practices of blacklisting. But I think right now, 6 days into November, we're kind of full from hearing about America and its practices of democracy. So I'm going to go to the other side of the globe, to Germany. In particular, Germany in the 30s through World War II. And it's important, since we're talking about Germany, to understand their tradition of church and state and the separation of church versus state. Now, there wasn't always a strong tradition in Germany of a separation of church versus state. In fact, in 1555, in the Peace Accords of Augsburg, it clearly states that the local populace of its region needed to conform to the religious beliefs of the local reigning prince. Now, luckily, if you belong to a different denomination, you were allowed freedom to pack up your possessions and leave. But there was that strong tradition that everyone would adopt the local religion of those in power and in charge, the rulers. Now, this kind of connection of church and state actually just grew more powerful when the little princedoms of Germany became an empire under the Kaiser. And the Kaiser took this to the next level and actually had a national church, an emperor, a church of the empire. The Weimar Republic introduced a new period of religious tolerance and a separation of church and state. And during that time, there was a free church in Germany. The church had its own ecclesial bodies, it had its own elections, it had its own administrators, it developed its own statements of faith, regardless of what the local rulers and people in political office and those with money thought. And in all honesty, some people struggled with that. They felt like there was a great sense of order and peace and unity when the church and state worked together. Now, Hitler, you could say many bad things about Hitler, but one of his gifts, unfortunately, was an astute political mind. And isn't it interesting that 2 months before he was appointed chancellor, that he actually strongly pursued a separate campaign. He devoted all his resources and all the resources of his party to a different election. And that election was a church election of presbyters and synodals, which basically means he wanted to ensure that his sympathizers and allies took over all the governing leadership positions of the Lutheran Church in Germany. Now, they were largely successful. In most areas of the country in participating in those church elections, about 70 to 85% of the vote went for those who were pro the National Socialist ideology. Those churches came to be known as the destroyed churches. In 5 areas, the National Socialist Party failed to elect its church leaders, and those churches became known as the intact churches. Here's a question of discernment for you. Why would have Hitler invested all that time and energy and power in co-opting this church if he thought the voice of the church had nothing to say? When Hitler became into power, he appointed a puppet to kind of run this large national ecclesial church, and he actually declared it the German Christian Church. And he appointed this guy named Mueller. Now, Mueller had no political sense, and he actually put together this huge religious event in the Berlin Sportsplatz. So tens of thousands of people gathered together for this religious event to hear the word of their new religious leader. And there they entered into this big sports stadium instead of sports banners. I wish I knew some Berlin teams back then. But there were these huge banners of the Socialist National Party, and there were swastikas. And there Mueller put forward the new teachings of this German Christian church. And he said this. He said, the real Christianity is the Christianity of the National Socialist Party of Hitler. The National Socialist Party is the true Christianity. And he continued. He said, the German people are answering the call of the Führer. And the Führer is teaching them real Christianity. The Führer is bringing a new revelation. Now, we don't often hear talks about revelation here, so let me break this down for you a little bit more. Right? Let me unpack this so you could understand it the way that the Germans in that big sports stadium understood it that day. He essentially said, Mueller said, that this one political party, the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Party, was speaking the true language of Christianity. That religion and specific political party had become aligned. And more, that the German people are answering the call of a specific individual who was talking the truth about Christianity and in fact revealing a new truth about Christianity, i.e., that the revelations according to Jesus were old and incomplete, that we weren't supposed to answer the call of Jesus as Christians anymore, and then in fact, they had replaced Jesus with Hitler as the true word of Christianity. I invite you to imagine with horror and discern what the world would have been like if the Christianity that shaped the world had Hitler at its center. Here's a really interesting thing. The German people who listened, who overwhelmingly at that time in 1933 were embracing an ideological cult of their Führer, reacted in disgust. For them, there were parts of their faith that were sacred. They understood the differences between a Jesus-centered church and a Hitler-centered church. And they held onto their faith and they said, here are lines you're not allowed to cross. And this is a really interesting moment because Hitler knew that that resistance was so strong, he wouldn't be able to win. And so from that point forward, he made no more attempts to co-opt the German church. Isn't that interesting? Imagine and discern and listen to what values you hold as so sacred that they would resist any power trying to persuade you otherwise. The Nazi Party only going forward, attempted to silence the German church. Now, those intact churches that I mentioned before, the 5 who refused to go along with the elections earlier, supported by Hitler's party, they began to be known as the confessional church. And I always think, as an unchurched person myself, that confessional is a little strange word, because I always think confession refers to the little place you go into where you say the naughty things you've done to some man who's dressed in some robe. But that's actually not what confessional means here at all. Confessions of faith are actually public statements of faith. They're ways that a corporate body, a community of like-minded believing folk come together and to say, this is what I believe. Here I stand in my beliefs, proudly, confidently, unflinchingly. And so the confessional church, these intact churches, made some statements of belief, but I'm going to lift up for you how they also meant these statements of belief as voices of moral dissent to what they saw happening around them. So for instance, they said, we believe that there was one Messiah, Jesus, who came to us, who speaks the true word of Christianity, and who calls to people into a practice of Christianity, i.e. not the Führer. They believe, in contrast to what Mueller was advocating, that the Bible retain the Old Testament, and that mentions of Jesus, all those mentions of Jesus being a Jew, be retained as well. When Mueller defrocked all clergy of Jewish descent and all clergy married to non-Aryans, they said, we believe in the holy rite of baptism, which says that anyone who converts is a true member of our community, i.e., you can't separate out people based on their heritage, make them less sacred or less seen as people or less worthy based on their heritage. They kept emphasizing that Jesus preached to Gentiles, and that in fact, we are meant to be open and accepting and tolerant and curious of others, i.e., not to perpetuate the anti-Semitism that was at the heart of the National Socialist Party. They advocated for the free church, that elections be held in a totalitarian state, free from state interference. I hope you see that what we believe and how we practice can provide a moral light in dark times. Now, there are many in the confessional church who stopped there, but there were a few who went further. One of them was a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I like Dietrich for a number of reasons. One of them, I have to say, I don't like this about him. He was unbelievably brilliant. So by the time he was 24, he had completed all his postgraduate studies in theology. And actually, even though he was able to become a professor, he was too young to be ordained in the Lutheran faith. So he didn't quite know what to do with himself, so he actually decided to do some research and take up a teaching fellowship at my alma mater, Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And so he went to the school that trained me, which actually at the time was known as an academic theological juggernaut. And while he appreciated Reinhold Niebuhr's works, Reinhold Niebuhr is perhaps the most dominant intellectual powerhouse among American theologians of the 20th century. Even though he appreciated Niebuhr, he thought really no theology is being done at Union. It's theologically weak next to Germany, which actually is true. But he gained another gift. One of his fellow seminarians, this black seminarian, invited him to his church, Abyssinian Baptist Church. And so he went to Abyssinian, and boy, did he fall in love with the music. He thought African American spirituals were great. And he listened to Adam Clay Powell Sr. preach. And he began to understand that theology can be done, in his words, from below. That there's a particular theology that was rich and true and being done from perspectives of oppression. He got so into that church that he started teaching Sunday school. When Bonhoeffer went home, he went home with two things. He went home with his first driver's license ever, and he went home with a box full of records of that church music he loved. Now, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, Bonhoeffer was the first clergy person that spoke up against Hitler. Just 2 days after Hitler was installed as chancellor, Bonhoeffer went on the radio and he said, "Let us beware of the idolatrous cult of the Führer that's beginning, lest we soon discover that he's a Wehrführer, or a misleader, or really a seducer." That radio address was cut off mid-sentence. Throughout the 1930s, Bonhoeffer led underground seminaries in Germany, and he traveled abroad trying to build ecumenical contacts and to warn the rest of Europe about the dangerous rise of Nazified Germany. In 1939, things became so dangerous that for a while he went back to Union, to New York City, and took a professorship. But he was distraught. See, he understood that there were real threats against his life were he to return to Germany, but he thought to himself and he said, how can I be part of rebuilding Germany's future after the war if I don't endure any of the trials of being in Germany now? See, Bonhoeffer was a deep-seated theological Christian. And what he understood about Jesus is that the Jesus that he knew and followed was a Jesus who was willing to take on great sacrifice. That there was a Jesus that was willing to speak up against this Roman Empire that was violent and hateful and destructive and divisive. And he said, who is the Jesus that is a role model for me? So we went back to Germany and immediately became censored. Not allowed to write, to speak in public, to teach. And he did all those things anyway. But he also was faced with this other dilemma. He knew that he'd be conscripted as a soldier, as everyone his age would be, but that he was a pacifist, but more, he would not fight for Hitler's armies, for the man he discovered, the man he testified was evil in every sense of the word. So it was a forced choice of being killed for being a traitor or standing up for his values. And interestingly, his brother-in-law presented a loophole. His brother-in-law was part of German military intelligence, the Abwehr, and he said, why don't you come join us? Now, this particular there was a particular cadre of people in the Abwehr, this German military intelligence, who were actually part of internal German resistance. And they said, we'll pretend that we're sending you abroad to spy for Nazi Germany, but instead they sent them abroad and they said, please tell all the Allied countries that there is an internal German resistance and that we are waiting here for the Allies to win this war so we could rebuild Germany together. And so Bonhoeffer traveled and shared this word and lived this double life. Now, the Gestapo began to get suspicious of the Abwehr, and they rounded up and imprisoned Bonhoeffer and many of Bonhoeffer's close associates. And during this uneasy time right before their arrest, they faced a difficult decision. You see, at great risk, they had put together a dossier documenting all the atrocities that the Nazis were committing and all the people that were fighting to make sure that those atrocities were ended, all the lives that they had saved, or Jews that they had smuggled out of the country. And they said, do we burn this to keep ourselves safe, or do we take the risk and preserve it so history knows the truth? And they decided not to burn it. This group in the Abwehr that Bonhoeffer was associated with launched an assassination attempt on Hitler, the July 20th assassination attempt, which, as we all know, failed. But when it failed, the Gestapo got serious, and they found that dossier, and they quickly tried and prosecuted everyone they found in there for being disloyal, including Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer, in these last days, was given an opportunity to escape. One of his prison guards had basically been converted by him. And he said to his guard, how can I leave when I know my escape will mean extra reprisals on my family and those associates of mine still held in prison. And so Bonhoeffer was executed just 2 days before the Allied front reached him. 2 weeks before the Allied front reached him. My spiritual companions, let's discern for ourselves for a few minutes. What is the role of the free and moral church in America today? How are our democratic processes of running our church important for the larger democracy of our country? In what ways is it important for us to talk about what we are noticing in our society and share the best of our ideas of how to move it forward in peaceful ways? What beliefs do you have? Theological beliefs, sociological beliefs, psychological beliefs. What beliefs do you have that make you more courageous, that call to you to take the risks of sacrifice, that shape how you act in the world? What moral leadership do you hunger to see? Starting on this Tuesday, on this next and near election day, let us come together and start to be moral voices of tolerance that uplift the worth and dignity of every person, that help us to come together as an undivided people. May we take up that task on Tuesday, and the next Tuesday, and the next Tuesday, until we finally build the democracy that we all yearn for. May it be so with our works. Amen.